Friends, welcome to our March 2014 webinar. We're really glad that you have joined us. This is going to be a really interesting and unique evening tonight, talking about a piece of history which really affects all of us, no matter whether we're conscious of it or not, whether or not we are or identify as Anabaptist or Mennonite. This is one of these movements of imagination that sent out ripples that really affected all of us. And this was almost 3/4 of a century ago. With us, we have Dr. Laura Roberts. She's sitting on my right. Wave, Laura, so they know who you are. And of course, you recognize Elaine over there on the far right. Laura is Associate Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Fresno Pacific University. She has a PhD in Systematic Theology from the Graduate Theological Union and is currently in the process of editing the bulk of the original Concern pamphlet series. You'll hear more about that in the course of the evening tonight. She's working with the publisher Wolfenstock to try to reissue these pamphlets. Because of their enduring value, there are only about a third of the Concern pamphlets that are still in circulation in print. So Laura's project is to get the remaining 12 into print. I also want to invite Elaine to say a word because it turns out that Laura is one of Elaine's oldest friends, and I know she wants to say something nice about Laura.
Of course I do. I was just thinking, Chad just told me I would be saying something nice about Laura. Laura and I met almost 20 years ago when we were both teaching at Fresno Pacific University. And actually, Chad should be telling this story because he often says he credits Laura for our marriage because Chad and I met at Fresno Pacific University in 1997. And I was on, tenuous ground about dating this guy, and Laura said, Elaine, he is a good guy. You need to date him. And then she came and supported us at our wedding and is a wonderful friend, very thoughtful, and has always been there when I've needed her. And I am so interested in tonight's conversation and very grateful for the work that you've done here. So thank you for being here.
So special welcome, and we're very, very happy that Laura has joined us tonight live. She's visiting from Fresno, has been with us for a couple of days. We had a fabulous conversation all morning about these issues. These issues are so consequential, even though we may only know a very little bit about them. So hopefully tonight we'll give you an introduction to the Concern movement as a movement of expansive imagination among Mennonites. We also have with us tonight, not on video, but very much on audio, Al Meyer and a number of Al's family. They are beaming to us from Goshen, Indiana. And we are really delighted, Al and family, Rich and others, that you have joined us tonight. It was a few years ago that Elaine and I had lunch with Al at a Mennonite meeting in Newton, Kansas. And Al began spinning these amazing stories of the times and the movement that you're going to hear about tonight. He is one of our venerable elders. He is one of the living witnesses to the movement that we're going to talk about tonight. So a very special welcome to Al Meyer. And we're going to hopefully see a little bit of video tonight of Al so you can hear him yourself. So we want to get started. Like any social movement, it came out of a context, and indeed a very dramatic context. In this case, the movement, or we pick up the story of the movement in Europe in the post-World War II period, where a number of Mennonite workers working in relief agencies are encountering some of the realities of the impact of World War II. Elaine has actually been doing some study about some of the refugees that were among the kind of people that these North American Mennonites would have encountered. I want to just let her talk for a minute about setting the historic context here.
Sure. Okay, so we are in the middle of World War II in Europe. And in the fall of 1943, it was just after the German army had surrendered in Stalingrad, the German occupation forces in Ukraine and Russia, and that is where most of the Mennonite community was, were retreating westward. And they were ordered to take with them the remaining population of Soviet Germans. And at this time, there were a lot of different Soviet German communities in Russia, and it was approximately 350,000 people that were retreating with the German army, and about 10% of these were Mennonites. And the majority of these some 35,000 Mennonites were women. And the reason for this is that in the 1930s, Stalin's government perceived Mennonites, along with other religious and cultural minorities, to be untrustworthy and potential threats to the state. And so this led to the arrest and disappearance of much of the adult male population through most of the 1930s, and then of course climaxing in the purges of 1937 and 1938. So it was mostly women, children, and elderly men who were making this arduous journey through war-torn Europe and trying to make their way westward away from Russia. On this journey, many of the people died of disease or starvation along the way, or at times they were overtaken by the Red Army and were killed by Soviet soldiers. Many of the women experienced sexual violence at the hands of both the Soviet and German soldiers. So by the end of the war, in May 1945, millions of people had been displaced, and the estimates range wildly from 20 million to 40 million people had been displaced. And of the 35,000 Mennonites who had left the Soviet Union in 1943, only 12,000 of them remained in Europe. Mennonite Central Committee will be familiar to most of you, and short term it's MCC. It was a relief organization from North America that had been established in Europe in 1920. And during World War II, MCC sent hundreds of workers from North America to manage relief operations and to make contact with the Mennonite refugees that were scattered across the continent. MCC established 3 refugee camps in Germany and then a center in Holland to distribute aid. These young MCC workers from North America, brimming with enthusiasm and a sense that they were called by God to do this work, were unprepared for what they saw when they encountered Mennonites and other refugees. Camps that had been set up to shelter 500 people at times were swollen to over 2,000 people. MCC workers were commenting on the lack of adult males, that they were all women and children, and that the women refugees looked at least twice their age and not at all like American women. So the violence and the hardship that these refugees endured, and also living under the constant fear of repatriation, being forcibly sent back to Russia, would have created a very dark cloud hanging over these camps. And so just this morning we were talking about that one of the concerned participants, Paul Peachy, was the director of the MCC Germany in 1950. And we don't know for certain if he encountered Mennonite refugees, but we can imagine that the young concerned participants would have either directly encountered or at least heard of the plight of their co-religionists.
So this is the context in which our story begins. North American relief workers who are also studying theology in Europe begin observing the situation of post-war Europe and trying to make sense of that through the tradition they've inherited. And this is where Laura picks up the story.
Sort of. I want to back up just a little bit because part of what shapes the response of this concern movement or group, the conversation that starts, really is best understood in the context of the decade or two before in terms of developments among American Mennonites. So I want to, and one way to think about the emergence of this movement, I think, is along the lines of a tension between separation and integration. So if you think historically about the Mennonite church, those questions around cultural engagement or withdrawal are a long-term part of the conversation. And this generation, as they're asking this question in the context of post-World War II Europe, is also wrestling out that tension. And in a way that brings them into conflict with the generation that precedes them in some ways that are really quite profound. So keep that sort of in the back of your mind as we're moving through this history. But backing up just a couple of decades, Mennonites by the 1920s are facing increasing societal pressures, Mennonites in the United States, toward cultural assimilation. And the question really is how to retain a distinctive identity in the face of this pressure. And historian Paul Taves, and I will rely on his work a lot this evening, identifies two possible responses in a situation like this. You can either focus on the boundaries or you can focus on the center in terms of thinking about how you solidify the identity of your group. And if you determine to work at identity issues by focusing on the boundaries, then you're really concerned to keep your group at the margins of society, because you need those sociological boundary markers, that real separation from the larger society to retain your separate identity, your distinctive identity. And so in that sense, you object to outside influences. You really view them as a threat to your identity and your cohesion as a group. On the other hand, if you focus on an organizing center as a way of articulating and sort of solidifying your identity, then you're open to much more fuller integration in the larger social setting that you're in. And in that view, elements of the larger society are really viewed as potentially infusing the group with greater imagination, greater vitality, and sort of ongoing relevance in the setting. And so beginning in the 1920s, Harold Bender and others of his generation work consciously really along the lines of this second approach. And they're building on some institutional structures and also some historical work already from the end of the 19th century. But beginning in the 20s, this really starts to take off, sort of recovery or even a renaissance of Anabaptist studies and church sort of development and building. And so as they work consciously at this task of articulating an identity for Mennonites in early 20th century America, they focus on what centers this group. I mean, they have some things to say about the boundaries, but the impetus is much more this sort of progressivist strand, where they're really trying to preserve and promote a sense of community through clear articulation of the historical ideals, faith, and heritage of the Mennonite Church for the present. And they do this by doing a lot of new historical work. They make resources from the 16th century Anabaptist movement available in English. And they really work to articulate a different understanding of Anabaptism in the context of Reformation studies. So popular understandings of Anabaptism at that point among church historians would have really been to view it more as sort of an aberration or a deformation rather than reformation. And Bender and others really work to present a very different understanding of the Anabaptist movement in its context. And that really clarifies actually in what becomes sort of the big culminating speech representing this development that gains a lot of momentum in the 20s and 30s. And that speech is the speech that Harold Bender gives when he is made president of the American Society of Church History. This is quite an honor and sort of a statement of the way in which Anabaptist studies have sort of come into their own by that point in history. And so he becomes president, and he gets to give the inaugural speech at the gathering of the society. And he gives a speech that's called the Anabaptist Vision. And so in this gathering of church historians, he chooses to present a very sort of compelling and focused restatement of the role of Anabaptism in the larger Reformation and of some of its central tenets, including the assertion, and this is a quote, that the great principles of freedom of conscience and separation of church and state and voluntarism in religion, so basic to American Protestantism and so essential to democracy, ultimately are derived from the Anabaptists. So again, in contrast to what had been this group that was viewed as, sort of very problematic and kind of troubling, Bender holds them up as, sort of the reason for religious liberty as it has become known in the American setting. Pretty striking contrast. And part of that is presenting the Anabaptists as the group at the radical end that really moved the Reformation to its logical conclusion as a separated voluntary church. So briefly, Bender identifies three teachings that are central to this movement, and they are important for the concern movement that we are looking at in the 50s and 60s, because they really agree with this description. They're shaped by the vision and its interpretation of 16th century Anabaptism and the characteristics that Bender lays out in this speech. So he talks about, for Anabaptists, the essence of Christianity as discipleship, so this active following after, the church as a community, and an ethic of love and nonviolence for Bender's generation, specifically passive non-resistance. So the emphasis on discipleship is understood as an active following after Christ in daily life. In other words, discipleship is a verb, this active, lived out, transformed life. The church as a community is the fellowship of those disciples who have voluntarily committed themselves to a shared way of life, which would be marked by mutual accountability and mutual aid and nonconformity to the larger world. And that would include separating out from the state church and an ethic of nonviolent love in human relationships, which contrasts to the state's violent and coercive practices. So Bender states this version of, the sort of what epitomizes the Anabaptist movement in the 16th century. And it's a way of doing history, but it's also really a way of clarifying what should guide mid-20th century Mennonites in terms of their self-understanding as they're sort of wrestling with these questions of identity and separation and integration in the American context. And he gives the speech at the end of 1943. It's published and republished beginning in 1944. So again, just think of the context in terms of where we are with the Second World War and what comes after. And in the midst of that, the tension of trying to articulate a viable identity for a historic peace church in sort of this very militarized American setting in 1944. So for Bender and his generation, this articulation of identity, a centering idea is really important, but it's also connected to a bunch of institution building that in some ways is best understood as what one historian calls a defensive structuring. So they clarify this understanding of, we are Anabaptist, and here we are as mid-20th century Mennonites reclaiming and understanding better what it means to be part of this Anabaptist tradition. But in tension with that, they take on the forms really that characterize Protestant denominationalism. So they build institutions and they build Sunday schools and all of those kinds of things. And so there's some tension between what gets articulated sort of as the vision or the ideas and these institutional forms that in some ways seem to be somewhat at odds or at least in tension with what's going on. And part of the need for this, part of what raises these questions around identity, one last comment about this context, is some of the sociological changes that have happened in the American setting. So by the time you get to the post-war generation, with Mennonites as with many others, you have the younger generation seeking higher education, moving out of rural enclaves. They urbanize, they professionalize, And so the question for Bender and others who care deeply about the church and its ongoing, viable witness in the American setting is really how do we talk about church as community? How do we visibly demonstrate this unique identity with in a social setting, in a community setting that really doesn't feel very community? I mean, you're not in these more insulated communities. You're in a larger urban setting. All of that, and so it's a significant challenge, really driven by big concerns around what it means to be the church. And again, there are sort of theological or idea questions there, but also really some concrete practices. So how does this relate to what we've come to call the concern movement? In the years immediately following the Second World War, young Mennonites, as Elaine has noted, volunteered to help with the relief and rebuilding efforts in Europe. And during or after that work, numbers of them also pursued graduate studies in Europe. And a handful of them decide to make basically what is described as a 2-week theological retreat. The correspondence about that happens in late 1951, and the meeting actually happens in 1952, the first one. And that seems to be because while they've been educated and shaped by Bender's Anabaptist vision or by institutions that seem to share that same understanding of what it means, they find themselves with many questions in the setting in which they find themselves. They are, in the words of one participant, overwhelmed by what they encounter in Europe. And he goes on to say the imagery and procedures and practices that they bring with them from home are inadequate to the work and to the witness that's needed in post-war Europe. And so they have many questions about what it means to be the church, what it means to be disciples in that time and place. And those questions are compounded by conversations and studies that open up for them the ideological debates that are and sort of philosophical concerns and currents that are sweeping Europe at the time. They want to re-examine their own understanding of the church and a Mennonite response to modernity. This is the pressing question. But they also recognize right from that first meeting the need to do that in a larger ecumenical setting. So the description that eventually emerges of them as a group is not identified as a Mennonite renewal, a group asking questions about Mennonite renewal, but they're asking questions about Christian renewal. And that larger ecumenical context in which they are asking these questions is really important because it places that conversation in a much wider space right from the beginning. So the original 7 who meet in Amsterdam in 1952 range in age, yes, you can see a picture. They range in age from their mid-20s to their mid-30s. And I will list the names. They are Irvin Horst and John Miller, Paul Peachy, Cal Redekop, David Schenck, Orly Schwarzenegger, and John Howard Yoder. And it is important to recognize the profoundly conflicted nature of Yoder's legacy. But it's also really important to note that he is the youngest in this group of 7. And while he emerges as its most well-known figure, the challenges and insights, the questions and the contributions of the concern movement or conversation really emerge from the group more broadly. They don't all agree on everything, but themes or areas of common concern are clear from the beginning and are much more widely held. And I think this is really important to remember as we learn about this history and understand what we can learn from it in terms of our current setting. So a sketch of that first meeting and some of the topics that were discussed, I think, really demonstrate this broader setting and contribution. Paul Peachy, one of the original 7, for example, presents in that meeting an interpretation of Western history that attributes the decline of the West to the dilution of Christianity rather than to a more generalized secularization of culture. And for Peachy, that's because Protestant Reformation, it fails because in the end, it has an attitude toward the world that is assimilative rather than prophetic. So you see this separation-integration tension, right? The focus of this question, which for him gets as big as, sort of the decline of the West. It's very huge. And in the post-World War II environment, which is construed as the end of Christendom, one of the participants already at that time uses the phrase post-Christian. In that environment that really marks the end of sort of Christian society or presumed Christian societies of some sort, Peachy sees it as an opening for the church to once again be the church. But this is exactly the question they're wrestling with. What does it look like? And what resources are there in our tradition to address these most pressing needs in this time that is very different? Orly Schwartzengruber's paper in that initial meeting talked about current American Mennonitism and drew a parallel between Christendom and Mennonitism, meaning the complaint was that denominational and institutional forms of the Mennonite church were sort of their own Mennonite society. And so the denominational forms were antithetical to this Anabaptist vision of the church as community of disciples, and said it was hierarchical, was taking on these forms that were really at odds with the heart of what the church was supposed to be. And it's a pretty stinging critique to draw that connection. Irvin Horst sort of provides an example of this in that first meeting as he talks about the loss of the 16th century vision among Dutch Mennonites. And so he talks about, what in the Dutch setting is this very sad story of accommodation and assimilation that begins with integration into the economic system. And so questions around economics and shared property, or questions of property or full community, what all that look like, end up being one of the big sort of ongoing questions and points of some difference in the group as the conversation unfolds. But as Irvin Horst is talking about that in the Dutch setting, he notes this progression from sort of first integrating into the larger economic system and ending up being culturally really totally indistinguishable from the rest of Dutch society. Paul Taves notes that for the original participants, the analogy to the American situation was all too evident as he laid out this history. So they're reading the history in a way that points to the questions that they're wrestling with in the current setting, and looking for what resources or models are there to address what's happening. So what starts to clarify in this first conversation is this real sense of a gap between the Anabaptist vision that was articulated and the Mennonite reality that they knew at home in its denominational form. The Amsterdam Seven would have agreed with Bender's description of the Anabaptist vision, those three basic tenets. They would not have agreed that the current, sort of form and institutional structures were a good representation or an adequate reflection of that vision put into practice. And so the call was for reform, to reform the Mennonite expression of church in light of the Anabaptist vision. As in the Reformation setting, the Anabaptists were credited by Bender with taking the reform to its logical conclusion. This really is the challenge in many ways of this next generation of scholars and church workers and missionaries who were themselves all shaped by, again, by Bender or by institutions who shared that view, but that saw a real disjuncture between the lived expression of the church and those ideals that were held out. And so they're calling for this reform, to a recovery or a reclamation of it should look different. What would it look like? In contrast to these structures that were increasingly hierarchical, leadership was increasingly concentrated, and there still were measures of sociological separation that didn't really make sense to them. They sit in the middle of post-war Europe, and it's hard to sort of imagine being separated in those sectarian ways from the larger society. So Irvin Horst identifies the call for a renewal of discipleship along New Testament lines as exemplified in the Anabaptist movement. But again, it's that sense of a call for reform connected to this particular historical tradition, but in this larger ecumenical context where, as they start to articulate this, others from other traditions also reflect the same concerns, and the conversation very quickly broadens. The group meets annually for these conversations from 1952 to 1958. There's maybe one more meeting in 1959. But after the second meeting are concerned exactly to sort of put these ideas or these concerns or questions into a larger setting. And so they decide to move to publishing occasional papers. And so the pamphlet series is born. The pamphlets that are produced, there are 18 volumes that come out from 1954 to 1971. And they address a range of themes and concerns, but sort of focus around two big questions in terms of the nature and mission of the church and the relation of the church to society. So,
can I just ask a question, Laura? You're describing this amazing small movement, and we're going to hear in a minute from Al Meyer, who joined this process in 1954. But this is a movement. No, that's okay. I don't have to be. Everybody knows what I look like.
okay,
We'll stay keyed. The camera keyed on Laura.
I'll keep smiling.
But you've mostly emphasized how these Mennonites were rethinking their own Anabaptist tradition, but in many ways they were opening the Mennonite world to a conversation with other churches and other theologies. Many of these people were being mentored by people like Karl Barth in their doctoral studies. Many of the mainstream Protestant traditions were approaching these Mennonites and asking for conversation around what it means to be a peace church, because they themselves, the mainstream Protestants, had been chastened by 2 world wars. And so these concerned people are both allowing ecumenical perspectives into the Mennonite world, but also bringing the Mennonite perspective out into the wider ecumenical conversation.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, just that as a student of theology, as you read through some of the history, the letters back and forth between members, where they're studying and the kinds of conversations they're having in their programs, it really is in many ways, in their programs of academic study, it ends up being in part sort of this list of who's who. I mean, they are in the middle of conversations with, in terms of how we usually tell intellectual history. They're in the age of the giants, and so when one of the members writes a letter to another and talks about studying with Karl Barth, and another one writes a letter back about Emil Brunner showed up to a conversation they were having, and what these are big, important thinkers and theologians in the setting, and so they really are sort of right in the middle of these huge. Intellectual movements, theological questions, and refashioning. And I think, Chad, what you've said is really a good clarifier. They come from settings that in many ways are really quite insular in terms of, in the case of the original 7, they've all either gone to Goshen or Eastern Mennonite. And from those, fairly parochial settings, find themselves again in post-World War II Europe, and in these, studying in Zurich and in Basel and these places with these big ideas and big people, and really a European church that is wrestling with what it means to be the church in this setting and the failures of the church. I mean, all of it's right there. And so it is. Yeah, I think the clarification you brought is helpful in terms of it is something that goes both ways. They find themselves opened to this wider range, but in those conversations, what they bring in terms of the way they've been shaped by an understanding of their own tradition and that particular voice in the larger Christian family at this time and place is also a really important resource in post-war Europe.
And I think it's important for us today to remember that this is all going on in the 1950s. in where America is locked down in Cold War consciousness. And here's a broad and a deep conversation around the church's peacemaking role happening at the height of the Cold War, at a time where everybody's got the bomb on the mind. So this is quite an extraordinarily expansive conversation for these times. It's a good time to show Al. Tim, I think we're ready for the video. Tim Nafziger and Charletta were in Goshen this last December and took some time to go over to the Meyer homestead there and had a conversation with Al, who was an original concerned participant from 1954 onward. And we have this beautiful 7-minute video, which we're going to try to show. We don't always have success showing video on these webinars. You're going to really have to strain because Al's voice is not terribly strong, but his spirit is. And so we want you to meet Al through this video.
And we sent it to him earlier.
The concern group began in 1952, as I recall, in Amsterdam, or in the Netherlands, at a meeting of 6 Americans working in Europe or studying in Europe. And I arrived in Europe a year later as a student at the University of Basel. And I first attended a meeting of the American graduate students in Europe, so-called, a year after that. So that would have been 1954. I did not consider myself a member of the church that was having these elections. But I saw the degree to which it was assumed that you were a part of the church unless you took extraordinary steps to get out. And I said, that's not my vision of the church. That's not my understanding of the way God intended us to live together as followers of Jesus. And many of the other friends in concern, what was called the American graduate students in Europe, had similar experiences and said, this is not the church of our dreams, of our understanding, of our vision. And we got together and shared experiences and then asked ourselves, is the shape of the church that we come from in the United States, in Canada, does it reflect our vision? And what does it tell us about what the church could look like in our times, when the state churches are in retreat and the time of the alliance of church with state is being questioned? Well, we thought the church involved conscious commitment and participation, and that there are ways in which our churches in America could involve greater member participation. For example, we studied the forms of leadership in the New Testament, and talked about congregational participation through having plural leadership arrangements with elders. We also thought that small groups would involve participation. And this is a story in itself, but it is hard for people now to realize that at that time, and after my return our return from Europe, small groups were considered a no-no.
Really?
What year would have that been?
57.
57.
They were divisive and cliquish, tore congregations apart. And also how we react to governments in which we find ourselves, which does not have to do with our shape of our internal shape of our church life, but has to do with our witness and our mission. And in the concern group, we talked about the church's witness to the state and to the society. And would have said, we need to be normal discipleship people and not killing, refusing to kill when asked to do that by the government. But that did not mean that we had nothing to say to a society that was engaging in activities that are contrary to its own and the world's interests. And that those two things can both be expressions of Christian discipleship at the same time. The impression was the Mennonites were a group, an unknown group, who were providing all this non-governmental aid. Why would they be helping their former enemies? And they're people of any kind outside their territory. And people were inquiring on the basis of what MCC was doing and their front line of relief effort, of relief help. People were asking questions that moved into theological dimensions quickly. Lutherans were asking about the degree to which the church had been impotent in facing Hitler. Catholics were asking some of the same questions. And the fact that there were pacifists who were doing something positive in post-war relief attracted attention and gave a hearing to a small group of Peace Church people that they wouldn't have otherwise had.
Wow.
We were members of the French Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was led by André Trocmé, Henri Closer, Jean Lasserre, and other our dear friends. These were friends of ours in the French sector. Now that was not the whole of concern, but concerned the American graduate students in Europe did meet at André Trocmé's place in Versailles, in France, one of its annual meetings. And we had, by the way, Frank Littell as our main speaker, and André Trocmé. And, but some of us were members of the Reconciliation FOR and went to its annual meetings. So we were at home in inviting people to Versailles, to our headquarters.
Is that over now?
Yeah.
Want to thank not only Tim and Charletta and Al for doing that taping, but also to John Bergen, senior at Oberlin College, who interned with us in January, who took that more than 2 hours of interview tape and distilled it down to 7 minutes, which you saw. I want to remind you that each of you have received the link of this 7-minute video, which is posted on YouTube, and so you can go back and review it if you missed any parts of it. So what a great honor it is to hear from Al, who preferred to be interviewed rather than to be live on the webinar, to try to steward his voice. But he is sitting with us in this circle on the webinar tonight, and hopefully you've noticed some of the comments he's been chatting in on your lower left-hand screen. Now, Laura, this is such an amazing convergence of people and ideas and circumstances. It's igniting the imagination of previously insular Anabaptists. At the same time, it's bringing the Anabaptist vision and witness into the wider church in a way that really is perhaps unprecedented since the Radical Reformation itself. And yet, there was some pushback. So talk about how some of this was received, first of all, within the Mennonite church back home in North America, some of these winds of change, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more broadly about its implications beyond the Anabaptists.
Well, the response comes along a couple of lines. There are, is the timeline up or available or no?
No.
Okay. So there are these annual meetings of the group that started in 1952, but by 1955, there are also meetings called concern conferences that are happening on the U.S. side that are sort of connected to Mennonite institutions, like educational institutions. They are focused around student questions. And so, on the one hand, there's interest among the young people in the American setting to pick up the questions and ideas that are coming forward via these pamphlets. The group starts publishing papers that are really intended for discussion. They're not presented as polished pieces. They're really meant to be a conversation piece and sort of part of an ongoing conversation. So as you look at this whole range of issues that run through the 50s and 60s up to 1971, you see stuff that isn't necessarily in polished academic form, although thoughtful and provocative, and that really seems to engage the younger generation at home. And so they have a couple of these conferences that are called concern conferences on the U.S. In the U.S. setting, and when the first of the pamphlets, the first collection of papers comes out in 1954, the history shows, the documented history shows that a copy of that was sent to church leaders, sort of with a cover letter that tried to explain a bit of what they were receiving. And there's this reticence on the part of this group initially to really sort of make themselves an organization or to elect officers, or even when they move to publication, to generate any sort of editorial council initially, because part of the critique is exactly this institutional form that the church has taken. And so they're reticent to add more institutional layering into the expressions of the Mennonite church, or these questions and the institutional form to the forum in which these questions around Christian renewal are being discussed. So there are some questions and clearly some misunderstandings that grow in part from that reticence to more clearly organize. There's openness on their part in terms of wanting to share these ideas and questions and critiques with the older generation. And the ideas clearly are also engaging the younger generation in the U.S. setting. So that's part of the story of the reception. It is also true that it does generate some conversation and some conflict between participants, the writers and participants in these conversations, and sort of institutional or denominational representatives. And so the fourth pamphlet that comes out in 1957 includes, thank you, a visual, includes some of the paper trail in terms of letters that have gone back and forth between participants and contributors, but also very nice. Also letters that have gone back and forth between denominational leaders and this younger generation. And that really points to part of a painful and painful and conflicted history in terms of this challenge. One way to read some of what happens with this group is, the next generation always challenging the older generation in terms of, what are the most relevant and appropriate, forms that the church should take. And there is some of that, but the enduring legacy of this group and the materials seem to point also to something greater than that. I mean, there's a way in which they turn to the church leaders and say, you made this problem in the sense of we have heard and received what you have taught us about the expression of the church in 16th century Anabaptism and the way in which that was a moment in terms of an expression of discipleship. We have learned well. And so now with that sense, we look at the church in our current setting and say, we have to ask again in this moment, what does that radical lived discipleship look like? And the painful part was that their conclusion was really that it looked quite different from the institutional forms back home. So there were some conversations. There's a timeline that's been published in one of the Mennonite journals, the Conrad Grebel Review, that indicates invitation by a couple of the members of the group to an interview with Harold Bender and a couple of others. And then there is a larger, more formal meeting that happens also in the mid-50s. And it's after that that the group demonstrates a little more clarity in terms of an editorial council and some of that clarity. They come out then in the 1957 pamphlet clarifying some of what their concerns are, sort of what are they about. And one of the biggest concerns, it's hard not to use that word all the time, seems to be some questions around whether the intention was really schism, like how does one construe this concern for reform of the church, and is reform possible, or will there also be a breaking away? And there were some really frank and wise words that came from the older generation, talking about schism not being the initial intention in the Reformation, and only when the Spirit leads is that an option. And so that too is an important part of the history of this movement, the sincere intent to be a reform versus a breakaway group, that sense of a commitment to the church, but also the reality of the conflict that generated with the older generation that held, quite frankly, the reins of power very strongly. I mean, they ran the institutions and ran the opportunities for publishing. And so to have a set of occasional papers or a pamphlet series that emerged as a way to put ideas into writing for discussion, we were talking about this morning. I mean, it's sort of like the 50s version of blogging in terms of a space where you could get some ideas out there and talk about it, because the other opportunities for publication were limited, and in some ways one could argue were tightly controlled.
Let me push you on this just a little bit, because as we were talking over Elaine's fabulous sourdough pancakes this morning, getting into some of this, you noted that the reason why these come out in sort of very plain vanilla format is that in some of the mainstream Mennonite publishing avenues were in fact not open to this group because of the ambivalence or antipathy of some of the leaders who were controlling those media. So in many ways, concern was blogging in the sense that it was an alternative media to get that conversation going when some of the more mainstream media weren't open to them.
Yeah, I think some of that's true. Although, to be fair, a couple of papers that could have appeared in the very first volume of Concern didn't appear there because they had already been published in the Mennonite Quarterly Review.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's we do best not to oversimplify the history. I mean, there's tension. The older generation resonates with this question of what does it mean to truly be the church in our age. And in that sense, they look at this younger generation and say, yes, you have learned well, even though they don't like all of some of where that goes. And so, Bender is happy to publish 2 of the papers from that first meeting. But it's also true that there would be other examples in the history of papers or even longer works that did not make it to publication because they really presented an understanding of the history or of the tenets of Anabaptism that moved in a different direction than the vision. And there didn't always seem to be a lot of room for that, especially in print. I think, I don't know this, I don't know if this is something Al Meyer wants to respond to or not. I wonder whether part of the interest in an occasional paper format was also part of this not wanting to initially be so tied into the established institutional structures, which again were really part of where the question mark was for them, and because their point was to pose the questions. I mean, there was a fair amount of correspondence back and forth between the participants in which they sort of reminded each other, to err on the side of humility, that you're putting ideas out there for testing.
When you wave your hands, it takes it out of focus.
That you're putting, I talk with my hands, that you're putting ideas out there for testing or for further refinement, or even, in the word of one participant, for admonishment. And that's a different kind of writing than would have been expected or probably accepted in something like the Mennonite Quarterly Review, a more established scholarly journal.
But it's interesting. I'm mindful that we have people like Joanna Schenck and Tim Nafziger online who are in a position today of trying to be a prophetic voice within the Mennonite Church, using blogs, using platforms sort of on the margins or outside altogether. And it's interesting that the Concern pamphlet series are really talking points. They really aren't fleshed out. So in that sense, a little bit like a blog as well, as opposed to this manifesto with all possible angles thought through. They're meant to be conversation starters, would you say?
Especially in the first decade, or maybe not quite, it seems. I mean, it changes once you get past 1958 or 1960. They include more off-prints from other sources. The group isn't meeting regularly, and you have maybe noticed part of what Al has typed in here. The irony of this group is that almost all of them end up spending careers, or large parts of them, connected to Mennonite institutions, and so there's some work to be done there, and they're aware of this. But that too is its own commentary. I'm just not sure on what.
Let's talk about that. So the Concern movement is conferencing and publishing throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. And then these young men sort of keep moving on into their own vocations and professional careers. Some of them become academics. Yeah. Some of them become church congregational leaders, pastors, or denominational people. And some of them actually do found alternative or communities, such as Reba Place Fellowship. John Miller, Virgil Vogt, the cover of whose book was on the cover slide of this webinar. So in that sense, there's sort of a spreading into the seminary, the sanctuary, and the streets, as we say here. Do you want to talk about that, sort of who goes on into the academic world, who has an impact in terms of these Mennonite institutions, who actually work more broadly ecumenically and sort of move outside the Anabaptist fold, and then maybe a word about some of the people who actually started alternatives, such as Reba Place in Chicago. Reba Place, for those of you few on the webinar who don't know, would have been one of the early intentional Christian communities.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which the diversity of occupations or settings that they end up in are as reflective of the diversity with which they come. So you have, two of the original members who come as missionaries with the mission board. You have some who come as relief workers, and those original 7 expand quickly to include others by 1954. So there is, there is that range in some ways at the beginning, and then also, of course, at the end. You said so many things. I'm trying to figure out where you want me to.
Obviously, some of these people have very significant academic careers. The most obvious one being John Howard Yoder. John Miller goes and starts Reba Place. Right. Others sort of tried to find their place institutionally, and it wasn't always easy. And some of them ended up at secular universities. Right.
So, for example, and I think Paul Peachy is an interesting example. He's one of the older ones in that original set of 7, and he comes to Europe with MCC. He's as Elaine said, directing MCC Germany by 1949 or 1950, and does a term of service with MCC in Japan then in the late 50s, from 57 to 60, and then returns to the U.S. and is in the D.C. area sort of doing peace and justice work, and then spends 20 years of an academic career as a sociologist at the Catholic University of America. But he also, with his wife, is part of forming, not talking with my hands, part of forming the Rolling Ridge Study Retreat Community, which is this place for retreat and study, but it also includes some residential, a residential component. So even there you have a somewhat of an alternative, not strictly an academic career, and not maybe more all of the more visible forms of peacemaking activism, but also this emphasis on a community and retreat setting, which is somewhat different. Reba Place Fellowship you mentioned with John Miller, and he's there for some time, and then he also moves into an academic setting. He came there from Goshen with a group of people from Goshen and ends up at Conrad Grebel, teaching for the last part of his career. Cal Redekop also comes with MCC initially in 1950 and starts teaching at Heston already by 1954 or so, and also ends his career at Conrad Grebel. So initially the participation is American, but contributors, and both the contributors to the pamphlet series, people who are involved in the conversation, and where folks end up in terms of their careers, bridges the U.S.-Canadian border. And this is a time when none of those denominations would have been separated. They all would have been binational organizations. So that maybe is part of what makes it easier to understand. David Schenck is a lifelong missionary with the Board of Mission, Belgium, and then other places, teaching often in those contexts. But so he's connected with sort of denominational structures for the entire time, but in settings and in ways that again really call for this alternative understanding. What does it mean to be the church in different cultural contexts, right? How those questions of the incarnation of the faith in a given setting are present with him, just given the nature of his work. Arlie Schwarzentuber was also with the Mission Board, and is one who finds himself, even as actually, again, looking at the documents and some of his own reflections in 1990, who spends most of his career as an Episcopal priest. I mean, that form of church was one that just in the end was much more suitable for him, for his understanding of faith and practice. And some of those questions were there for him already in those early conversations in the 50s. You mentioned Yoder, who comes to France in an MCC appointment and does grad studies and then returns to the U.S. in 1957 and is the secretariat. I mean, is working at the Mennonite Board of Mission for 5 years, and is a really important person in World Council of Churches, you know, as a representative in these larger conversations. And then, of course, the teaching career, I think, is well known.
Right. So, and I want to invite participants to be thinking of questions that you want to chat in to the box on the lower left, and we'll see about how we can respond, or Al can respond to them. So in just a couple of minutes, we'll move to your questions. The concern movement is
Just ask them to put it in this box.
the Q&A box,
This box right there, yeah. Not the one left chat.
and they can do that?
Yep.
Okay, so Tim is requesting that you use the question and answer box for questions. Quakers are involved in these conversations. A little bit too much for some of the Mennonite leadership. There are real ecumenical connections. The Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was not only ecumenical but to some extent interfaith, certainly Catholic Protestant at that time. So this is a real point at which Mennonite relationships with broader progressive ecumenical movements begins not only to flower itself, but I would say leavens the ecumenical peacemaking conversation in a way that informs a lot of the faith-based contributions to these social movements of the 1960s, beginning in the mid-1960s. So even though Mennonite, you can't think of too many Mennonite figures who are prominent in the big social movements of the 1960s, many of these ideas have been circulating already now for 10 or 15 years and leavening that conversation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and the connections with other groups that are also asking these questions of renewal, again, in what is a pretty tumultuous time. I mean, those connections come early. It's in Concern publishes a pamphlet first and sort of becomes more identifiable as a group. And then second, at least in my understanding of the history, is the Quaker publication, The Call, and a lot of conversation between these two groups in terms of the questions of renewal. There is a word of admonishment in the larger meeting between this younger generation and the elders in the Mennonite denomination that you should probably not get too friendly with the Quakers. But again, hermeneutic of generosity would mean, part of what's driving that concern from Bender and others is that question of is it going to be reform or is it going to be split, and how will the center hold? So again, parts of those conversations were extremely difficult and painful, and lots of misunderstanding, and even in the most difficult of those moments, conversations like this are recorded about Harold Bender. Someone says to him, "Well, we hear you're having trouble with some of your young people," and his response, at least at that point, was, "Yes, but they love the church." And so that sense of a shared concern for what it means to, again, in a concrete setting, live out this expression of what it means to be the community of disciples, even though there were at points sharp disagreements over whether the previous generation had gotten it right and whether the younger generation was going to. And that includes concrete expressions around peacemaking. I mean, the shift that comes with this generation is also the one that a couple of sociologists have described as the shift from quietism to activism. So in terms of the peace movements and expressions of peacemaking, the way they take off, it's an assessment of passive non-resistance as a thoroughly inadequate response in the post-war context.
Right.
And so there's no disagreement from this group on that third tenet that Bender identifies as this ethic of love and non-violence, but there is real disagreement on it as non-resistance or passive non-resistance, and that expands to allow for and eventually in many contexts expect greater social and political engagement. And that's the shift away from, in some ways, sort of the remaining sociological separation or sectarianism to a fuller engagement. But then you're back, still with that question: what does that full activist engagement look like in tension with a sense of a different, or how is it animated by a different community reality? How do you, on the one hand, express this alternative community reality out of which that is possible, and still demonstrate this engagement and love of the world in which we find ourselves?
And of course, there's lots of other things going on in the world at this time, not least the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and that is having an impact on Mennonites. And to some extent vice versa. Quakers sort of break out of the box in nonviolent direct action in 58-59 through sort of ban the bomb protests and civil disobedience. Catholic worker movement is an influence. Much of these things reconstellate in a retreat that happens in the fall of 1964, convened by Thomas Merton, the great Trappist. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, because the author of a recent book on that 1964 retreat is on our webinar tonight. We'll come back to that in a minute. But let's look at some of the questions here coming from our friends at the Prairie Wolf Collective, wanting to know any evidence of any women in the early movement, and also they want to know where they can learn more about intersections between Concern and Quakers.
Yeah, so to the first question, there are, the work that I've done, I'm not aware so much of women in these conversations that are happening through 1958, but it's clear as the pamphlets, keep rolling out, the contributors aren't only men, there are also women who are making contributions in terms of the writing. I have to think a little bit about the response to the second question in terms of that overlap.
But you're saying some of the footprints of that are in one of the Concern pamphlets about.
Well, that's in volume 4.
If you click it, you can see Al's answer as well.
Awesome.
Sorry, click where?
Click on the question that you just read, and you should see Al's answer as well.
Okay, and do that on each of them.
Each of them, yeah. You can read that out loud as well.
Okay. So Al is saying the archives would have letters about contacts with Quakers, and that would be in the Mennonite Church USA archives. But as someone who's working with editing these Concern pamphlets, this is good input to know that there's interest. And presumably the Call magazine among Quakers would have also reflected some of that influence.
And when it first comes out, for example, they sometimes do a series of book reviews at the end of the Concern volume. And when the Call first begins, there's a comment on, this sort of sister publication. So things around volume 4 of Concern 1957 is where some of those things are, either in the correspondence between the participants and among themselves, or with the denominational leadership, or in some of the book review stuff that comes in the back of those.
All right. Hetty was asking about a particular piece, As You Go, not one of the Concern pamphlets, but Al is clarifying that it was one of Yoder's publications. Al, on the question of gender, Al is saying there were women involved in the conversation, particularly in Versailles, that they did not write. And that was then, and this is now, Joanna Schenk.
That's 1955.
Versailles is 1955. And Al is further clarifying that pamphleteering was in part because they wanted to have a certain independence in their expression from church leadership. So it was sort of an unofficial organ. So one of the reasons why we're focusing on some of these details of the concern movement is because of the very evident parallels of social movements then and now. Young people pushing out the boundaries, finding alternative expressions to air and amplify their views in uneasy but often creative and tension-filled relationship with the institutions out of which they have all come, those kinds of things. Laura, as you were reviewing this morning each of these conferences that were held, you said that they were rarely more than 20 people in the room or 25 people. So they were small.
Right, more often less. I mean, initially it's 7 and then maybe a dozen. And the larger conferences are ones where, for example, they were meeting together with the Quakers and Bruderhof. And so there were a couple from each group. But yeah, often 10, 15, the large group noted would be 25.
Yeah. That's extraordinary all in and of itself. And I'm prompted to say, small, focused, strategic conversation, no matter how small the group is, can have amazing historic consequences. When you look at the long view of history, movements don't fall from the sky. They start out in church basements in the civil rights movement, and they start out in small conversations in Amsterdam in the case of the concern movement. Now, Gordon Oyer, and please chat to confirm that you're still on the on the webinar, but Gordon Oyer, one of our friends on the webinar tonight, has just published an entire book about another small conversation, I think less than 20 people, that gathered at Merton's monastery in 1964 that included John Howard Yoder, but also radical Catholics like Dan and Phil Berrigan, A.J. Musty, a longtime venerable American pacifist, a number of members and collaborators with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As I recall, Gordon, who is in fact still here, Paul Peachy, I think was, I remember reading in the manuscript, was meant to be at the Merton retreat. Gordon has just published this book, it just came out last week from Whitfenstock, called Pursuing the Spiritual Roots of Protest, and is another example of doing what we might call archival work that breaks open the hidden history of the roots of movements. So I see a lot of parallels between what Gordon has done with this very famous retreat of people who then became leaders in their respective fields in peace theology and peace activism from the Merton retreat, very similar to what you are doing, and others, of course, with the concern movement. So Gordon, thank you for giving us this book. Gordon is saying that Paul Peachy was involved in the early organizing of the 1964 retreat. So, I mean, there's a genealogy right there of continuing to convene strategic conversations, now one that's much more widely ecumenical, and yet the tentacles of these kinds of conversations just go out far and wide. And to me, that that establishes a genealogy between the concern conversations, not only the substance, but the spirit of those conversations, and what happens with Merton in 64 and beyond.
Well, and that breadth for what becomes known as concern is there already, 2 or 3 years in, where by the time they're putting out the second or third volume, the contributors already are outside, are other than only Mennonite, thinkers or scholars. I mean, the conversation has broadened. So their initial intention to ask and seek counsel or sort of ponder these questions in a larger ecumenical setting. I mean, there seems to be a way in which they view the questions they're asking as answerable from the base of ecumenism, because they are questions of larger Christian renewal, even though they're asking them in this context of Anabaptist history. Can I make a comment about the impact on the church? Because I was really struck by what you were saying in terms of the lasting impact even of conversations or gestures or publications that are made by a much smaller number of people. I mean, as the historians look at some of this, people like Paul Taves, but also other folks like J. Lawrence Burkholder, who sort of work to make some assessment of the impact of this movement. There really are some concrete ways in which these conversations and these publications really did change some of what was happening in terms of the Mennonite Church in the U.S. setting. And there are three things that, at least, that are easy to identify concretely. One of them is that there is the critique in many ways of the church being misidentified with hierarchical institutions, and the call instead to reclaim the church as the fellowship of believers, that is the basic unit of church. And in light of that, the call for increased congregational autonomy versus sort of conference-held bureaucratic autonomy. That shift really does happen in terms of a reclamation of much more congregational autonomy. And that's again, recognizing the local church sort of as the basic unit. And that raises all kinds of challenges for the concerns around being, a connected community of churches. But that shift is one that really results from conversations and concerns that are in the wind and in the constituency because of these publications and conferences and some of that. The second is the house church movement and emphasis on fellowship groups and koinonia. I mean, the people involved in concern and its writing and the conversations come home and work to sort of live out these convictions and questions in their congregational settings. But as we've noted, numbers of them are connected to larger institutions or denominational structures. And again, their concern is for the reform. And so this blossoming of house churches and of koinonia groups and the concern for fellowship is something that emerges, even though, as Al noted in the video, that small groups are suspect in terms of these questions around alternate authority and are you going to be cliquish and is it schismatic? But it really becomes a viable form that's explored into the 60s and beyond. And the third thing is, and there's some tension here, on the one hand you have church pastoral leadership moving towards a monopastor, a single pastor who has been educated, a professionalizing of the pastorate. But in the face of some of these questions raised in the American setting, but also in the Canadian setting by publications like the Canadian Mennonite, there really is, at least for a time, this exploration, even in theological training, for alternative models for pastoral leadership that hold on to multiple leadership, an emphasis on lay leadership, lay involvement, all of that. And those in those three areas, just as a starter, the nature of what the church is like in the last third of the 20th century, for example, really is different because of this movement.
I want to pose a question to you, Laura, and also to you, Al, and it might involve a certain amount of speculation, but many of these original concern folks are students of Barth's. We know that Barth was profoundly influenced by the confessing church movement in terms of changing some of the traditional stands, such as on just war. Barth, in the late 50s, becomes a rather militant nuclear pacifist, calling into question the whole tradition of just war. Comes to America and immediately tunes into people like William Stringfellow and sort of alternative voices. Is it too much to imagine that Barth himself might have been influenced by some of his Mennonite grad students who were pushing him on some of the logic of his magisterial Protestant theology?
Well, I mean, at one level, I don't know how he couldn't be, because of the way he construed theology and theological articulation. Excuse me. So he, I mean, you know, his big magnum opus is called Church Dogmatics, and it's something that was sort of always being written and rewritten. And in that sense, you know, there is always this openness to a rearticulation and being reshaped. I think the other thing that makes we want to say yes is because the questions that were driving them were about the lived expression of the church. And these were, you know, core questions for Barth. And there are questions that engage, you know, the arena of ethics and again, this lived expression. And that was so central to what drives him to do the writing and the thinking on paper that he does. Mm-hmm. That it's hard to imagine not.
Now, I know that Yoder published a book called Karl Barth and the Problem of War, and he chronicles some of the theological conversation around this, but it's been years since I've read that book, so I don't know if Yoder actually demonstrates some touch points, but it's kind of interesting because it shows just different ways in which this concern movement leavened the wider conversation, which in turn leavened the wider church. I'm not seeing any more questions, but we do want to give Al Meyer a chance to respond to anything he has heard before we close. While we're waiting for that and for any final question, I want to bring to your mind that our next BCM webinar is in a month on Tuesday, April 15th, Tax Day, a good day to practice war tax resistance. And this is continuing our little mini run of Mennonite theologians here on the BCM monthly webinar. We're going to have a conversation with Ted Grimsrud, who's professor of theology at Eastern Mennonite Seminary in Virginia. Ted has also just recently published this book called Instead of Atonement, came out last year from Wolfenstock. And on April 15th, in the middle of Holy Week, we're going to have a conversation with Ted about atonement theology and what that means as we reflect on the meaning of the death of Jesus in both for Christian theology and practice. So we hope you will tune into that. That should be another interesting theological conversation at a moment where atonement theology is being rethought across the board among Protestants and Catholics. It's kind of one of those moments around some of those ideas, and Ted's been right in the thick of it. Laura, let me invite you if you have any final thought as Al is typing in his last comments. Just any reflection you want to leave us with. The edited and republished Concern pamphlet series will begin coming out in serial fashion, we think probably 2015. Not this year, but hopefully next it'll begin coming out. So you might look for those. They'll be published by Wolfenstock. Any final thought?
Yeah, too, on this latter, there are three republished version volumes that are already out. One is called The Roots of Concern, and that actually gives you all the content from the first 4 volumes. And we've talked a fair amount about volume 4 today. These are all Wolfenstock publications. There's one called Concern for Education. Often the pamphlets had a thematic focus. And there's one that's coming out in the next 6 or 8 months that is the reprint of the last volume, which was a Radical Reformation reader. And there's a way in which I think that ending point sort of demonstrates coming full circle. I mean, you know, this conversation starts initially with graduate students who have been shaped by this reclaimed, you know, understanding of an expanded understanding of Anabaptist history, and they seek a lived expression of the church that's faithful to that moment, you know, as itself an expression of faithfulness to New Testament Christianity. And so in some ways the parting shot is again, you know, making sure some of those resources are available in terms of this wider conversation. And that I think is really important. I started my comments today by talking about this tension between separation and integration. And I think for me, that one of the things that has really interested me in this project is the way in which what we have with this pamphlet series is in some ways a model of how to engage the questions and issues of the day. There are strong thematic resonances at points, I think, with the sort of tumultuous and uncertain times we find ourselves in terms of how people view denominations and social issues and all kinds of things. We're not in post-war Europe, but we are in a time that feels like a bit of a moment in terms of some differences, especially around questions of what it means to be church. And so the documents, the articles, the series sort of gives us two things around this question of what it means to be church and how that falls along lines of separation and integration in a tradition that understands part of the gospel witness as including this prophetic voice, shaped by peace and by presenting an alternative way, an alternative community. And so you have this model of a discussion where they don't always agree, but are trying to hammer out concrete understandings of what it means to live out this commitment to a gospel of peace in a violent world. And you also have some ideas or some clear demonstration of them doing that really with the concrete issues of their day, which press us easily to say, oh, they do one issue where they're talking about sort of political and ideological engagement, and then they have a number of articles that talk about Marxism and communism. So in our setting, what would be the parallel? What would be the articles and conversations we would have around political ideologies that we need to think critically about and engage? So that's what I mean by a model of engagement, but also some observations that really cross over in terms of those basic questions around what it means to be a church for whom discipleship is a verb.
Mm-hmm. Well, Laura, it's so exciting that you are doing this project to bring the concerned movement to the attention of a new generation, which it rightfully should be. In many ways, it's part of our genealogy of faith, and so thank you for doing that work editorially and for doing this work, being with us tonight and talking about the concerned movement. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Al Meyer, you are our elder. We love you. We so appreciate you being willing to sit down with Tim and Charletta in December for 3 hours, and again tonight with us for another hour and a half. We want to leave your comment as the last one. Al, you're full of great stories about those days, and I hope you get those down on tape or on paper. This is a story that he told Elaine and I a few years ago. Shortly before Yoder had the final defense of his dissertation, Bart came to Al and complained that the Mennonites are bellicose because they're always arguing about the 5% that they disagree with their magisterial Protestant sisters and brothers, and not focusing on the 95% that they agree on. To which Yoder replied, well, I was just doing what you, Bart, did with Calvin. You argued on the 5% that you disagreed with. Well, both of them might have been overstating the case, because there may be a little bit more than 5% of disagreement. Or maybe Bart was just a closet Mennonite, hard to say. But what an amazing moment in the history of theology and the history of our churches. Conversations, crossing boundaries, cross-fertilization, morphing into greater health for the whole church. So we're so deeply grateful, Al, to you and all of your colleagues for the faithful work in the 1950s, trying to ask hard questions, and that is what we are also trying to do in our time, and we want to continue to learn from you, our elders. Friends, we have come to our time. We're so grateful that you have joined us tonight. You will shortly be receiving a link with the archived version of this webinar, which you can review. perhaps show to friends. We hope that you will continue to help us spread the word of these webinars. We are trying to do the pamphleteering of the 21st century. Each of these webinars is a little bit of a concern pamphlet trying to raise issues and push out concerns about the church and the world. And this is one of the ways that we can do it using technology. So we hope you will help us continue to grow this movement. Thanks to Tim for your help on the technical side, particularly for uploading the video. Again, much love to the Meyer clan there. Al signaling back his thanks. And again, thank you, Laura, for being with us tonight. And thank you to Elaine.
Yeah.
All right, friends. We'll leave the room open for a few minutes if you want to continue to respond to the poll that Tim has put up. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month, we hope. Bye-bye.